Hi, this is Steve with Palladino Power Project, bringing you the series CP and FTP for Runners, Part 1. This is going to be the first one of a number of topics that I'll be covering on CP and FTP for runners. And we'll probably try to get these out about every 4 days to a week in the series. So um, please subscribe and hit the bell icon to be notified when these come out. So this one is going to be the definition of CP and FTP for runners. And that's a good place to start this series. So we're on equal ground in terms of understanding what this CP and FTP mean. And by the way, if you're new to these acronyms here, CP is critical power, FTP is functional threshold power. So here is the definition, and let me start with the most important paragraph, the first one there, that FTP and CP are conceptually the same thing. They're both identifying the same thing conceptually. They represent a phase transition between the heavy and severe intensity domains of exercise. Essentially, exercise intensities with a slow component of fatigue, which is the heavy domain, and exercise intensities with a fast component of fatigue, which is the severe intensity domain. So to put that in graphic terms, this is where CP, FTP come in identifying the phase transition. Now, notice I'm not using threshold because threshold implies that at one point you're in one domain and you and one lot higher or one step higher you're in another intensity domain, just like your body or your physiology changes just abruptly from one thing to another. That's what threshold implies, and there really aren't thresholds in physiology, truth thresholds. So what happens is a phase transition. It's a continuum. It's a continuum, not abrupt starts and stops. So CP-FTP define the phase transition. And notice how I put a little space between each of these intensity domains. That's to sort of highlight that in there's a phase transition. And CP-FTP sort of, or not sort of, they identify the phase transition domain between heavy and severe. And there's other metrics, physiologic metrics, MLSS, lactate threshold, or LT2, ventilatory threshold 2, VT2. They're all identifying this phase transition, or attempting to. Now, they're all different. They're all different protocols. They're all different models. And in fact, if you look at LT2, there are multiple protocols and models. VT2, respiratory compensation point. All of these have different protocols and models, but they're all trying to identify that phase transition, as does CP-FTP. The difference is that in identifying that phase transition, CP-FTP allows the user to do it with field-based testing and does not require lab testing. And then, of course, there's a phase transition down between moderate, which is typically more aerobic exercise, and they're VT1 or gas exchange point, and LT1, lactate threshold 1. or quote unquote aerobic threshold. Again, it's not a threshold, and it's not that this is anaerobic here and this is aerobic here. No, and neither. And although this has been called anaerobic threshold in the past, it isn't that you're aerobic here and anaerobic here. That threshold does not exist. It's a transition, phase transition. So we'll come back to this later on as we go into zones and intensity zones and so forth. But for today's video, the definition of CP and FTP falls into identifying, representing that phase transition between heavy and severe intensity domains. Now, just a little bit more in the heavy domain, just to identify that and define the heavy domain. Those are exercise intensities with a slow component of fatigue. Exercise can be sustained for a long period, typically is much longer than 30 minutes. Now, time out. I use 30 minutes as an example. It's not a cutoff. It varies from individual to individual. All right. So it ties into time to exhaustion at FTP or CP intensity. So, and time to exhaustion, we'll cover this in another video, will vary across individuals. So I'm only including that 30 minutes as sort of a rough example. Don't include it as the definition. So heavy domain, again, in exercise intensities with slow component of fatigue. Exercise can be sustained for a long period, typically much longer than 30 minutes. And typically this is lies below FTP CP, that phase transition, and all the way up through FTP CP. And typically in that phase, in that heavy domain, you can achieve a quasi metabolic steady state, and you will not reach VO2 max. There's a slow component, but the slow component does not lead to VO2 max. So once again, the heavy domain is where it's slow component of fatigue, longer durations, typically longer than 30 minutes, can be sustained at a quasi-metabolic steady state, and VO2 max will not be achieved. On the other hand, once you cross that phase transition, which FTP and CP is trying to identify, you're getting into the severe domain, and that's exercise intensities with a fast component of fatigue, meaning typically metabolic homeostasis cannot be achieved. It's sort of in a ramping or spiraling upwards in terms of metabolic homeostasis degradation. The VO2 slow component may lead to VO2 max. It often does if you have the right combination of intensity and duration. I'll explain that when I go back to the graphic. And the exercise fatigue failure predictably occurs typically in minutes, and that's usually less than 30 minutes, but again, varies from individual to individual, so don't use 30 minutes as a defining number. So let's go back to the graphic. Severe domain, and in this domain, you're going to have fatigue, which occurs within minutes. It's a fast component of fatigue. You can't reach metabolic homeostasis or steady state, and VO2 max usually can reach VO2 max. Now, I mentioned it depends on the intensity and duration. So if you're down here at just over FTP CP, let's say 102%, and you're doing that, the duration of that is 3 minutes, you're not going to reach VO2 max. You're not. But if you were at 102% and you did that for 50 minutes or 45 minutes, i.e., a 10K, you might approach VO2 max at the very end, or an 8K road race. You might reach VO2 max at the very end. So duration is an important adjunct to the intensity to determine whether you actually reach VO2 max or not. So there you have it. There's the definition for FTP and CP. And I want to additionally say that FTP, functional threshold power, this is a term coined by Dr. Andrew Coggin, and this is back in the early 2000s, prior to 2003. And actually, he delivered a paper to the USA Cycling Coaches in 2003 where he talks about FTP and the ways of estimating it. Unfortunately, people have sort of bended in some of the things that he has said and come up with these incorrect definitions for what functional threshold power is. Functional threshold power is not 60-minute power. Dr. Coggin said that it's functional threshold power is what one might hold in a 25K time trial, might be close to an hour, about is the term that he used. It just gives guidelines, sort of like what I did with 30 minutes. Do not use time to define FTP or CP because it varies. Time to exhaustion varies from individual to individual. So this is 60-minute power is wrong. And then there's a test to estimate FTP, 95% of 20-minute power. By the way, that was developed for cyclists, number one, not runners. And number two, it ignores the variance of W prime or RWC, reserve work capacity. So this is a model, a protocol and model for estimating FTP. It does not define what FTP is. FTP defines or attempts to identify that phase transition. Now, I will also point out here that in Dr. Coggin's 2003 paper where he first presented this concept, he mentioned critical power model and critical power testing as a good method for identifying what functional threshold power is. So FTP and CP are conceptually the same. They're both identify that phase transition. The only difference between FTP and CP, the primary difference I should say, is that the estimates of FTP and or CP are protocol, execution, and model dependent. So if you use 25% or 95% of 20-minute power, you're going to get a different estimate for FTP CP than if you did a 3-minute and 15-minute maximal effort test and put it in a linear 1/time model for estimating CP. And if you took that same 3-minute and 15-minute uh, maximal effort test data and put it in a hyperbolic CP model, you're going to get a different estimate. They'll be close, but it's going to be different. So the difference between FTP and CP is the way that estimates will result in the number. The estimates are going to vary from protocol, execution, and model. So the protocol, execution, model determine the estimate of these values, and they're essentially conceptually the same. Any variances are because of protocol, execution, model. So we'll sort of tie up this video by, again, saying FTP and CP are conceptually the same thing. They both represent a phase transition between heavy and severe intensity domains, between exercise intensities with a slow component of fatigue and exercise intensities with a fast component of fatigue. That's the definition of FTP and CP. Oh, by the way, I've done a study where we're looking at the same test data over a number of runners that's entered into a WKO's model for estimating modeled FTP and Stride's model for estimating CP. And Stride's model is a derivative of the Golden Cheetah model. And when you input the same exact data into those two models, one estimating FTP, one estimating CP, they come up with the same values, or essentially no significant difference in the study that I did. So again, the same thing, they identify this phase transition between heavy and severe, and the only difference really is protocol, execution, and model dependent. So thank you for watching. That's the definition, and stay tuned. We'll get into some of those other topics, and thank you for watching. We'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.